tell you why the pandemic made you cranky and exhausted and how to reverse it, and why being chased by a tiger 24/7 is so exhausting, I'd like you to step back with me in time, 25 years to be precise. It was a very hot and sweaty day, and I was very pregnant, and I had just climbed the stairs to my home office and was faced with a huge pile of questionnaires that I had to work my way through. I was busy working with a group of really smart school children who couldn't focus, couldn't concentrate, and were doing really poorly at school. The kinds of children that teachers and parents throw their hands up about and say, these children should really be doing well. So I was the last resort. And as I worked my way through this pile of questionnaires, I was truly astonished because every single questionnaire said the same thing. You see, I'd had a little bit of extra space on one of the questionnaires that I'd developed, and I asked all of the students a question that was completely unrelated to my research. And now, answering and looking at those questionnaires, I was really astonished. And I sat back in my chair, and I can remember very clearly thinking to myself that destiny doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just nudges you. Maybe you can understand the feeling. Maybe this has happened to you too. Because in that moment, I was faced with making a decision. I could either stay the safe and predictable path of pursuing the talking cure, being a psychologist, or I could step away from my colleagues and go towards a very uncertain future with a lot of questions. And destiny led me in the direction of the road less traveled. So let's move back to the tiger, where I want you to once again invoke your imagination with me. So let's imagine you're walking through this beautiful forest. It's a lovely day and the sun is shining through the green leaves and you're calm and at peace. But suddenly you hear a rustle in the bushes, and before you can think, you're running away from that sound as fast as you possibly can. Unfortunately, regardless of whether we are facing a physical threat, like a tiger chasing us, or a psychological threat, like the pandemic has imposed on most of us, our body and our brain responds in the same way. You see, the fight, flight, and freeze stress response is an ancient stress response that works perfectly in an environment like the jungle, but rarely battles in the complex world that we've created for ourselves today. Now, unfortunately, it's not just the fight, flight, or freeze response that's been in action for the last 18 plus months with most of us. We have another part of the brain that's also involved with this stress response that has gone on for so long. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. But let's just get back to what happens in the jungle when you're running away from that perceived threat. The body and brain steps up very quickly to get you out of a situation where your life is threatened. And the stress response was only meant to last for between 30 to 60 seconds. Because you see, in that period of time, you either got away from the tiger and you didn't need the stress response anymore, or you became his lunch and then you didn't need it anymore either. So 30 to 60 seconds is what we were designed to respond to stress with. 18 plus months is not the same period of time, obviously. So what happens to us when we are exposed to this ongoing stress? Something interesting has to happen in our body and our brain for us to be able to get away from that tiger, real or not. And a whole lot of pieces in a puzzle have to come together to give us the energy to flee very quickly. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that adrenaline and cortisol have to come from somewhere. Where do they come from? If you've ever asked yourself this question, you're going to have that question answered right now, because as these pieces of the puzzle make up adrenaline and our capacity to escape, they are made up of something called nutrients. The food we eat provides nutrients for adrenaline and cortisol to be synthesized. And as you can see from this slide, there are quite a few of those puzzle pieces that need to be in place for the stress response to be responded to and for the body and brain to get out of that space of immediate stress and threat. Now, just think about this for a moment. If we've been feeling this way for the last 18 plus months, can you imagine how many of these nutrients we have been using to be able to get us away from that rustle in the bushes, this ongoing threat and feeling of overwhelm and confusion that the pandemic has left us with? These are the nutrients that are required to make the adrenaline and the cortisol that have been helping us to run away from this imagined tiger. To put this fight, flight, or freeze response into context, I'd like to tell you about the three structures that set it into motion: the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and our adrenal glands. The hypothalamus and the pituitary glands are the size of a small pea, and our adrenal glands are the size of medium-sized grapes. And they have been used over and over and over in the last 18 plus months to get us away from this tiger of overwhelm and uncertainty that the pandemic has left us with. Unfortunately, this is not the only thing that happens when we have this stress response. The capacity to feel calm and relaxed and serene and ready for sleep, i.e. safe and secure, also requires puzzle pieces or nutrients for that to happen. And as you can see from the slide, they are separate until they fit together, as you can see with this slide. Specific nutrients required to allow us to get into that state of mind to feel relaxed and calm and ready for sleep. So this neurotransmitter that is created from these nutrients is called serotonin. And serotonin is the foundation of what happens, which allows us to go to sleep, which is the synthesis of melatonin. Once again, all of those nutrients or puzzle pieces fitting together perfectly to allow us to go to sleep and sleep restfully. And here are those nutrients which are required to get us into that state of sleep. Something that I think you just need to keep in mind is that one of the reasons that when you lie down to go to sleep, you may feel very wired, even though you're really, really tired, is because the body and brain has prioritized the synthesis of adrenaline versus the synthesis of serotonin and then melatonin. You see, when you feel like you're being chased by a tiger, your body and brain isn't exactly encouraging you to lie down and have a little nap, are they? No, they're not. You still feel as if you're being chased, regardless of the fact that you're physically and mentally exhausted when you lie down at night. And if you've been very alert and very awake, which I trust you have been, you will now know that the same nutrients that are required to make adrenaline are the same ones that are required to produce energy. So if you haven't felt like being energetic, as in this slide, it's because you haven't got those puzzle pieces available, because your body and brain has prioritized survival over resting, sleeping, and having the energy to exercise. So here are those nutrients, the same nutrients required to get us away from the tiger, to allow us to go to sleep and to feel energized. So you're beginning to piece together what's been happening in your body and brain over the last 18 plus months. If you only have a certain amount of nutrients required, what will happen is that you'll run out of them, and you'll only have enough to keep that stress response going, but not be able to feel safe, settled, calm, be able to go to sleep, and also have enough energy to feel like you can do what you need to with your life and exercise well. Of course, you now know that the same nutrients are required to keep you in a good mood and to help you feel energetic enough and to help you feel like you can cope with life, to think critically, to think clearly, and to be able to make decisions based on feeling good, not feeling like you're overwhelmed and stressed. As you'll recall from the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that the stress response didn't only use a certain part of the brain, it also uses part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the part of the brain that really makes us fully functioning humans. It allows us to plan for the future, so consequential thinking. It allows us to take responsibility for our behavior. It allows us to manage our emotions, and it allows us to think creatively and innovatively. This is the part of the brain that is also the most energy hungry, and it gets involved in a stress response when the stress response carries on for too long, as it has in our case. So instead of just running away from that tiger, the prefrontal cortex gets involved and asks questions such as, have we experienced this before? What do you think the best decision to make in these circumstances is? Why is this taking so long to get resolved? Why are people making these kinds of rules? Is there a better way to do this? And so on and so on. So there's a backwards forwards between the stress response and this very sophisticated prefrontal cortex that we own. The challenge is that the prefrontal cortex is the greediest part of an already greedy organ, the brain. You see, the brain uses upwards of 20 to 25% and more of the energy that we consume, and it's only 2% of body weight. However, and the prefrontal cortex, at only 10% of the weight of the brain, uses upwards of 20% of that energy that the brain needs. So we know that the brain is very greedy by itself, but taking into account the prefrontal cortex, it uses up even more energy. And that is one of the reasons we have been feeling mentally fatigued, because the prefrontal cortex has been running out of energy, out of nutrients. And so it battles to help us think clearly. It battles to help us figure out what is actually going on and how best to cope with it. And so we become mentally exhausted, never mind just feeling physically exhausted. So let's just step forward for a moment and have a look at something else related to the brain, which is our synapses. Each of the 83 to 86 billion neurons that we own make connections with other cells. They never actually touch those other cells or neurons. They jump across what we call a synaptic cleft to get to the other cell to deliver the message. Why is this important? Because the health of those synapses will determine how well the neurotransmitter is firstly synthesized at that spot and how effectively it jumps across that synaptic cleft to get to the other neuron. And something really important needs to be present for these synapses to work really well. And I'll get to that in a moment. Something else that you may already know is that the brain operates on an electrochemical current or currents. So electrochemical connections between neurons mean that they can speak to either right next to each other, their neurons, or they can speak to a broader area of neurons. But all of this connection and connectivity takes place in a very small space, which is the brain, but it's a very interconnected and busy place. For example, we've got 160,000 kilometers of blood vessels in the brain, and upwards of a liter of blood moves through the brain within a minute. So this is a very, very complex and very greedy and very busy part of our body. And it's been battling under these last 18 plus months to be able to cope really well in this really complex situation that we found ourselves in. So what do we do, or what have we learned to do when we run out of energy, when we feel cranky, when we feel that our brain isn't working really well? Well, there are two things that we do. And one of the first you can see right in front of you. We reach for a cup of coffee. Now you may be saying to yourself, there's a whole lot of great research about how good coffee is for us. And yes, that is true. But there's also a lot of research about how coffee may not be so good for us. So I just want you to entertain this thought. Researchers, we are all human too. And there's a whole lot of researchers who research coffee and its effects on the body, who walk into their offices and labs every day with a cup of coffee. And there are a whole lot of them who don't walk into their offices with a cup of coffee. So you can guess which way either of those groups are going to go. They have got an inherent bias to say good things about coffee if they love coffee, and bad things if they don't love coffee. But ignoring that for a moment, I would just like to show you how coffee works in the body. In my in-person presentations, which I really love and miss doing, I always ask the audience, do you want to know how coffee works? And unsurprisingly, 50% of the audience put their hands up and say, yeah, they do. But I can see honestly that maybe they don't really want to know. And the other 50% shake their head and say, no, they don't want to know. But I convince them that it's better to have knowledge than not. And when I give them a lovely chocolate treat to eat while I'm telling them the science, it does seem to sweeten the information. So let's have a look at how coffee actually works in the body. As you can see, the first thing that will come to mind here is that coffee obviously contains caffeine. The other thing that you will note is that coffee allows the body to convert that caffeine and use it as adrenaline. Now, the next thing you'll notice is that caffeine blocks something called adenosine, which needs to rise during the day and peak in the evening for you to be able to go to sleep. So if you've been relying on coffee to give you energy, you may get to the end of the day and not have any adenosine, which works with melatonin and serotonin to allow you to go to sleep. The other thing you will note in this slide is that coffee does drive you to go to the bathroom because it's a natural diuretic. And what do we want after we've had a lovely cup of coffee and that lovely pleasure and energy jolt? We want another cup. Now, if you're really awake, and maybe it's because you've had some coffee and you're very alert, you will see that the adrenaline in this slide will be piquing your curiosity because you now already know that adrenaline is really expensive from a nutritional perspective because you saw the slide of what is required to make adrenaline. So now you're piecing it together. I can see. You now understand that every time you drink a cup of coffee, you are using up nutrients to be able to make adrenaline. So although coffee works like express post, you do get the parcel sooner, but it costs you more. You can see that drinking coffee will give you energy, but at the expense of a whole lot of nutrients that you could be using to create serotonin, melatonin, energy, and keep your mood stable. So this is an important slide for you to think about when you decide whether coffee is serving you or whether you are serving coffee. There is nothing wrong with enjoying a cup of coffee once or twice a day, but if you are relying on coffee to give you energy which you can't find anywhere else, then it's time to address that crisis of energy which is underlying your desire for coffee. So coffee does have some components. One of them is antioxidants. And another thing that coffee does, it normally provides us with a great environment to chat to our friends and connect with other people, which has been lacking in the last 18 plus months. But if coffee isn't serving you and you are serving coffee, you need to have a conversation with yourself about that issue because it's an underlying issue related to a lack of enough of the nutrients required to give you energy to feel really good. So what's the second thing we do after we reach for coffee when we're feeling cranky and exhausted? We reach for something that will make us feel good in the moment. We reach for some processed food, like the donuts on the screen. We have learned that when we consume something that's highly processed for a brief moment, maybe a couple of minutes, we end up feeling calmer. It's as if this processed food allows the tiger to disappear for a little while. So this kind of food actually dampens that hypothalamus pituitary fight, flee, freeze response. How does it do this? It's pretty interesting really, because these kinds of food allow the body to produce what we call endogenous opioids. Yes, opioids, the drugs that make us feel calm and relaxed. And they do this via a complex mechanism, which you don't have to understand. But what you will already have maybe recognized in your own life is that this then becomes a learned response. We learn that these kinds of foods make us feel calm and relaxed, even for a little while. And this makes us feel better. And so what do? We naturally gravitate to that kind of food. The problem is that that kind of food leads to what we call blood glucose highs and lows, or the blood glucose roller coaster. Why is it important that we understand about the blood glucose roller coaster? For the simple reason that there is no place to store energy in the brain. Have you ever thought about that? There is no place. When we store energy on our body, we all know where those places are, don't we? But there is no place in the brain because the brain doesn't have space, and so it relies on a stable and consistent supply of energy throughout the day and the night. If we don't supply enough of the right nutrients and enough of the right foods to provide energy for the brain, we end up having highs and lows. And the first one, as I've just mentioned, is our food choices. When our food choices are highly processed, these ups and downs lead to increased stress simply because the highs and the lows lead the body to feel as if it's experiencing a feeling of stress. So a tiger chasing you and poor food choices exacerbate our feeling of stress. The other challenge that we have is if we get really, really hungry, our blood glucose also dips very quickly. And then most of us had the feeling of feeling hangry. We're really hungry, we're really angry, and so we're just very unpleasant to be around. The more often this happens, the more unstable our blood glucose becomes as well. The next challenge, which a lot of people also don't know, is that when we are dehydrated, we also release adrenaline and cortisol into our body, and that also drives blood glucose up and down until we rehydrate ourselves. And then, of course, the last point is lack of sleep. When we don't sleep well, our blood glucose also becomes unstable, and we naturally gravitate to highly processed food, which give us a quick jolt of energy and lower our stress response. So keeping our blood glucose stable is an extremely important part of looking after our brain generally, but specifically allowing us to become more stress resilient, to be able to cope with whatever our physical and our psychological stresses are, because there's no place to store energy, as I've mentioned, and we need to keep our blood glucose stable to allow the busy brain what it needs to cope well, and allow that very greedy prefrontal cortex to have enough nutrients and energy to allow us to think creatively and find solutions to our big challenges. And as if adding insult to injury, when we are very stressed and our blood glucose goes up and down, a certain enzyme is produced in our body which tells any excess energy, i.e. what we store as fat, to go to our abdominal region, because there are 4 times more cortisol receptors in that tissue than in other parts of the body. So if you have felt and noticed that you have put on weight over the last 18 plus months, particularly in the belly region, this is the primary reason that this has happened. This is also a very hard part of the body to lose weight from. So don't despair. It is possible, but that's the reason that it happens, because stress particularly likes to send fat to our abdominal region. So you may now be saying to yourself, okay, I now know that adrenaline uses up nutrients. I also know that serotonin and melatonin use up nutrients. I also know that energy uses up nutrients, and they're all the same kind of nutrients. So the body really battles to apportion them across all these different compounds that need to be made to allow us to be healthy. And then, of course, having a stable mood is also requiring nutrients. So what kind of diet should we be consuming? The diet that has garnered the most interest from a research perspective, because it offers robust results, is the Mediterranean diet. And the first thing you'll notice about this slide is the color. The food that we eat should have loads and loads of natural color in it. That color provides special compounds that help the body stay really healthy, things like antioxidants, which allow the body to repel the damage that stress imposes on our cells, and also for a number of other reasons. The Mediterranean diet also has a lot of fiber in it. And if you've been around the block in the last 18 plus months, you've probably heard that what happens in the gut affects what happens in the brain. And of course it does. Our gut is our second brain. So if you eat this type of diet, you will naturally have enough fiber to be able to make all the beautiful, good bacteria that the gut requires, and the bad bacteria will die away naturally. This kind of diet also supplies you with good clean protein, good fats, and also, as you can see, a lot of minerals that are also required along with vitamins. So this is the kind of diet we should be consuming. If you have a look at this bowl of food, there's a lot of fiber involved, there's a lot of color involved, good fat from the avocado, and that's the kind of meal that we should be focusing on. As far as fats and oils are concerned, the discussion about them is a very complex one. And my lecture on that takes over 3 hours, which I don't have to use here. So let me just clarify it and make it really simple. We need to eat more of these kinds of fats and oils and less of these kinds of fats. Why? Because the omega-3 and omega-6 fats are damaged by light, heat, and oxygen. And when oil gets processed and put into plastic containers, it becomes damaging to our cell membranes, specifically to our brain, which is 60% fat when you take out all the water. And between 20 and 25% of that fat needs to be this kind of fat, the fat that comes from nature, that comes from sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, pepita or pumpkin seeds, cold water, fish, and of course, we have flax seeds and dark green leafy vegetables. The discussion about consuming fish is a complex one because our oceans are now full of things like heavy metals, PCBs, and dioxins. So never rely on cold water fish to supply you with the omega-3s that you need. But you definitely can consume enough of the plant-based omega-3 and omega-6 to keep your brain really healthy too. So none of the oils in plastic. Have that as a major rule for the way you consume oils. If you avoid all fats and oils that are in touch with any kind of plastic, you will be avoiding damaged fats and oils, which is extremely important for your brain. Something else that the Mediterranean region does, or the people that live there do, or used to do, because this research is based on villages that still adhere to the old way of living. They communicate with each other and eat in community with families and friends. Eating is a wonderfully happy and festive occasion. They don't eat alone while they're watching the news. They eat with family and friends, and a lot of very good, important neurotransmitters, one of which is oxytocin, is released when we eat with family and friends and those that we love. So that also enhances our health and helps us to stay healthy for longer periods of time. We're not only consuming all the right nutrients for our busy brain and to cope with stress, but we're also becoming more resilient because we're with community and friends and loved ones who support us when we're living through adversity as well. So there are a number of different factors involved with this particular way of eating. As an aside, a lot of people have been very concerned about their immune system during the last 18 plus months. And this slide gives you a very clear indication of how stress impacts the immune system. Anything that impacts our capacity to feel calm and relaxed will impact our capacity to sleep well, will impact our endocrine system, which is our hormones, and ultimately lead to a dip in our immune function. So if we need to make sure that our immunity is operating optimally, which most of us obviously want, we need to be able to understand what stress has been doing in our body and how to become more stress resilient. And I've just told you exactly how to do that. Once you start providing your body and brain with all the nutrients that they need to operate optimally, you will ensure that your stress response will be lowered naturally. And that will automatically help your whole nervous system work more in alignment. You will then also sleep better. Your hormones will function more efficiently and your immune system will step up to the challenge. The challenge is, of course, to make food taste delicious so that we don't feel deprived. So I'm going to tell you a little secret about why the low-fat diet craze died a terrible death. You see, flavor molecules in the food that we eat disperse optimally in fat, not in water. So if you are eating a diet that is devoid of fat and oils, you will not enjoy your food, which is why when the low-fat diet craze started, food manufacturers had to add a whole lot of additives into the food to make it taste okay. So they had to add flavor enhancers and a lot of color to make what really tasted like cardboard taste okay. Now we know they were on completely the wrong track. So if you want to make sure that the food that you're eating is really, really healthy, make sure you've got a lot of good fat to go with that food, because then you'll be able to have this beautiful domino effect of enjoying really healthy food, making sure that it tastes really good, and making sure that you become stress resilient, because you're also going to be eating all of the right nutrients to be able to make the compounds, adrenaline, cortisol, serotonin, melatonin, and all the mood enhancing neurotransmitters as well. And of course, you'll have enough left over to make energy. I'd like you to keep this image in mind when you consider how our brain and body are coping in the complex world that we've created for ourselves. You see, the way we evolved, or the way we were designed, really operated very well when we lived in a jungle. We could respond very quickly to an imminent threat and then calm down very quickly afterwards. But we have created a world for ourselves where our body and brain really battle to function optimally. So we have to be very conscious of what we need to do to be able to supply this old-fashioned or ancient structure, the brain and the body, with what it needs to be able to cope in a world where it wasn't really designed to operate. Today, you've learned about how expensive stress is, and now you have a very good idea about why you have felt cranky and exhausted, why you may have put on a lot of weight, why you haven't been able to sleep well, and why you have felt so overwhelmed over the last 18 plus months. Of course, we can't separate all the other reasons that we felt that way. But if our body and brain can't operate optimally using the nutrients that we supply, it is so much harder to become stress resilient and to cope well in this really complex world that we now find ourselves in. Before we circle back to how our brain is coping in this environment, I would just like to leave you with an analogy. If you saw someone pushing a car and all the tires were flat, what's the first thing that you would ask them? Well, maybe the second thing, because the first question would have something to do with whether their brain was working well. But the second question would very likely be, why don't you pump the tires first? You see, that's part of why I made the decision that I did all those years ago. If you're living in a situation and things aren't running smoothly, wouldn't you first deal with major problem and solve it first before you looked at the next set of problems? And that's the way I look at nutrition and the brain. And I've given you a clue for what was found on the questionnaires. Hopefully you're still alert and awake and interested in what I have to say next. And maybe you're saying to yourself, she's forgotten. She hasn't told us what was on those questionnaires. So now I will. Every single one of those questionnaires, one after the other, told me that all the children in my experimental group, that's the children who were doing poorly at school, loved junk food. And all the children in my control group said exactly the opposite. They didn't love junk food. And that's why I was left with such a dilemma. I knew that it wasn't only about trying to talk these children to be more motivated and focused. I then understood it wasn't only the psychological variables that were affecting their underachievement. I then realized that food had a big role to play in it as well. So that was 25 years ago, and I cannot go back in time, unfortunately. But I can ask you a question based on everything that I've discovered in the last 25 years. I can say to you, tell me about your favorite food. And that would give me a very good inkling as to how well your body and brain were working. So I encourage you to think about this. Think about everything that you eat and how it's either contributing to your brain functioning really well and helping you coping and becoming more stress resilient, or whether it's undermining your health and the way that you are feeling. Because we ultimately have decisions to make every single day, and our world is becoming more and more complex. The last 18 plus months have certainly taught us that. So I invite you to think about what your favorite food is and think about changing what it is if you know that it doesn't serve you and help you live your best life. Thank you.